This is what I've got. So we've got massive demonstrations over the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, forcing President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign. Food, fuel, medicine shortages have been really bad. 60% inflation rates, like on a scale we can't even imagine. In April, Sri Lanka defaulted on $51 million worth of debt. And obviously this led to, we saw the presidential palace getting stormed. You saw people swimming in the pool, which was really tight. Part of that debt is because there's been a long time economic mismanagement and corruption by, in part, the Rajapaksa family in a country that's massively reliant on IMF loans and structural adjustment programs to get those loans. Then leading to this precise moment, 2019 tax cuts that actually didn't go so well. Of course, what climate change folks are like, polluters are saying was the real problem, which was like the ban on fertilizers, chemical fertilizers in 2020 that happened, but it did really stretch farmers in the country. And then COVID. And on top of COVID, the war in Ukraine. So you've got like literally everything coming in rapid succession. The COVID meant a lot of lockdowns. And now we're here. And the president resigned. The prime minister was just sworn in as interim president. And it's kind of incredible how this convergence of all these different crises that seem to be like a slower burn, but were sped the fuck up by COVID, by the war in Ukraine, by everything going on. So is that sort of, is that right-ish?
You did great. You did great. I would say that Sri Lanka is the canary in the coal mine when we take a look at ways in which neoliberalism elected authoritarianism, and also the ways in which majoritarianism also allowed for the consolidation of authoritarian power. This over-reliance on debt, a trade deficit, being over-reliant, also a divestment in domestic production, and becoming really reliant on imports, which I think a lot of island nations find themselves in that situation as well. So, and then also this idea that, okay, as an island, we've got tourism is going to be the industry. So how do we make Sri Lanka sexy for tourists? How do we, import fancy cars? How do we, because, they banned the import of chemical fertilizers overnight. You need a transition plan for that when, the Green Revolution, we've been dealing with this stuff from the 1970s, and then you're suddenly, you're not following the science with that policy. But it's, they weren't, banning the import of luxury cars.
Right. Right. That would impact the rich people. That's no good.
So there was, like you said, a conversion of multiple crises, definitely successive governments, and a history of neoliberal structural adjustment policies. I think a significant one to be looking at is some of the policies that happened in the 1970s, which was that was a scary IMF. That was also the IMF of mass sterilization in South Asia as well, right? So so there's definitely been successive authoritarian governments, successive neoliberal policies that have led to this moment, and we also have had a family that has been lining their pockets, stealing from the people. Intense nepotism. I mean, we're talking about so many of the ministers being family members. So this current prime minister that has become the acting president was appointed by Gotabaya after his brother, who was the previous prime minister, was forced to resign after his house was the first one to get burnt down. So. It's
It's only so many mansions left and so many positions left. So tell me about the people. Like, who's been taking the streets? Who are some of the main groups? And like, are there any emerging like opposition leaders and figures? Is there the Sri Lankan Zelensky, or is it more decentralized than that?
It's decentralized, though people are trying to co-opt the movement, and there are definitely groups that are going, or people going around saying,
with the co-opting.
Yeah, they're trying to co-opt, and they're also trying to be like, oh, this came from. So one of the largest sites that's occupied is at Galface, and the abbreviation for it is GGG. But also it has turned into Goda Gan Gama. Before it's Goda Go Gama, and now that Goda's gone, it's Goda Gan Gama. There's so many different groups that are occupying that space, that have come together, that have different tents, that represent different issues. And then some folks are more. They were part of formal movements. So, there was a huge general strike that involved teachers, healthcare workers, trade unionists, free trade zone workers. Some of the folks that have been at GGG have included the mothers of the disappeared, who have been protesting for years. I don't have the exact number, but so many
mothers of like political disappearances, ethno-religious disappearances.
And so many of the mothers and the families of the disappeared are those who, they're during the war, and especially during the last years of the war, Sri Lanka had one of the highest rates of disappearances in the world, right? So there were so many people who actually waved white flags, surrendered, and they were, and sometimes their families like encouraged them to, because they were just like, that's the safest way in this moment, and they were disappeared. So and then there's also been journalists, political activists, people who have dissented against the government, who have also been disappeared. So and then this was also 2 historic prides that also happened in the North and East. Was the first time that Jaffna had a pride celebration, and then in the South it was the largest pride mobilization, and that was part of the protests as well.
So the general strike and like pride marches?
Well, yeah, I mean, different at different times, right? So there's been, and it's like there'll be. So there have been rich streams of movements, right? Folks that have been organizing, from plantation workers to free trade zone workers to farmers to people who were impacted by the human rights violations that the Rajapaksa family. So those formations have been organizing for some time, right, before this moment. And then, but what we're seeing is what's so mind-boggling about this moment is the mass mobilization, and folks who actually voted in this regime awakening to their crimes and being like, you lied to us, and then also the ways in which the protests have been happening is that it's been a rapid transformation and exchange, especially amongst young people, where also all these different streams are converging and people are learning and exchanging information and doing teach-ins with each other. And then at Gama or Gan Gama now, decisions are actually made through collective consensus. And so there's folks who represent, and that could include the person who's making tea for everybody, right? So like there's different, some people are like providing food there. Some folks, they never protested before, but they believe in, they want ethical governance. And then there's some groups that are more formally organized and formed.
It's like an Occupy moment. Sorry.
It is. They occupy. They are occupying the Gulf Face Green, and then it was an occupation also of like the presidential palace, the secretariat, the prime minister's office as well.
Do they have drum circles too?
Yeah, people are playing. There's been also the Malayaha community, did some ceremonies and rituals to also get go. So there's been like so many different, also Ramadan also happened during the protests as well. So there was also folks who were breaking fast, and there's so much different cultural presence and exchange that's happening that is also unprecedented, especially for this generation.
Part of what's, I feel like when things, just to be honest, like the point at which I started paying attention was when they got in the pool. I was like, you can do what now?
They're like, let's have a pool party. And,
I was
people
like,
play the pianos. They cook to the kitchen. They started
they're storming in and using the boss's pool. Like that seems like that's dope. So then, but it seems like it's like started out. It often starts out with some pretext, like upset about gas prices, and then over time it expands to encompass more issues and raise more systemic demands. And what's your sense of like how the rest of the Sri Lankan ruling class is relating to the government right now? Like, is there like, are they trying to like throw these particular politicians under the bus and then contain broader democratic reforms? Or what's the space between the government and the rest of the ruling class? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think elected officials and the political elite, they know that they can't not pay attention to the uprisings and the people and the struggle. It's called the people's struggle. And I think there's a desire to return to normalcy where they continue to maintain their power, and some of these contradictions and hypocrisies are less exposed, right? So there's definitely, let's calm down. Let's get this IMF loan. Let's
you can't use my pool. Out. Okay, some of you can use my pool sometime, please.
And it's
here's one inflatable pool for all the people.
Right?
Sorry.
Yeah. So it is a mass, definitely class awakening of not just the ways in which this regime has been corrupt, but also all of these stories and kind of the neoliberal myths and like, this is what's going to bring us prosperity and security. And, Gotabaya coming into presidency was also on the backs of Islamophobia as well. And so, it's an imperfect movement, because there are people who this is their first time ever protesting, sometimes thinking about these ideas. It's a moment of change and exchange, and things that all the protesters aligned about was that Gota needed to go, and they won that, right? Yeah. He fled the country. He was ousted by the people. So
it's a huge victory. It feels like also like the Argentina que se vayan todos, like 2003 moment. 2000. Why am I blanking if it was 1 or 3? I'm an asshole.
But that cross movement exchange is really important, especially as folks push against anti-austerity measures and some of the, the contradictions of the IMF as well, because the ways in which the IMF approaches a European country versus, a country in the global South. So I think learning from Argentina, learning from Lebanon, learning from, other peoples who have gone through these situations is really important right now.
Yeah. And what do you know of like the demands? Like what comes next in terms of what, at least what seems like most people can kind of get down with?
Well, there's what most people get down with, and then there's the progressive demand. So I'll start with, like, I think most people are aligned with, they get that what allowed for the authoritarian consolidation of power was the way in which the executive presidency was set up, which was set up in like the 1970s. It wasn't originally, something that was part of the Sri Lankan governance. And then also the 20th Amendment, which happened in 2020, which also gave the president way too much power and undermined any parliamentarian like checks and balances. And so abolishing the executive presidency and the 20th Amendment is something that many of the protesters recognize. So there is a desire for structural change.
Going to a parliamentary system, stop with the executive having so much power.
Yes, and many of the progressive groups and who I'm in solidarity with and who have been resisting the Rajapaksas for over 15 years are, want devolution of power beyond the parliament to the most local level in a way that, but not in a way that just empowers local elites, but that, ensures equitable, inclusive processes for caste oppressed people, for poor people, for gender oppressed people, for so because devolution of power is an incredible demand, and the implementation of it has to be something that doesn't also just empower local elites, right? And then Ronald, okay, this folio, this diabolical, Ronald said that he was going to resign. Right? Like when Goda said he was going to resign, Ronald also said he was going to resign.
This is the prime minister, right?
The current prime minister, the one that was appointed after the brother, was like, okay, I'm going to resign.
He was like, I'm going. And then he was like, JK.
Yeah. And then, Goda appointed Ronald to protect his own assets, right? And his own interests and, to try to, I mean, he turned on the people, Ronald, but the people were like, yo, this dude needs to get out. We got his brother out. Now we need him out. And now you're slowing down the process, right? And then Ronald said he would, but now he hasn't resigned. There is going to be an election by the parliament. Folks from GGG are wanting is somebody to be acting president, interim president, who doesn't have political ambitions, so that their commitment is not about gaining more power, but their commitment is about addressing this economic crisis, making sure that people get fed, making sure that there's a food distribution system that is going to fend off starvation, making sure that that the people's needs and wants are that essential goods gets to the people, that the medical crisis is resolved. And there's a fear that a career politician is going to undermine the will of the people, and it's going to become this like stabilization. Let's have security, let's play with the IMF in a way that doesn't actually hear the demands of the people and the mandates of the people, which is that people need to be fed, people need healthcare, and austerity measures that goes against it is not something that that people are going to allow right now.
Yeah, and there has to be a renegotiation of the debt. I mean, the 2001, Argentina crisis. I mean, like it was a utter shift. And there was a renegotiation of debt with the IMF. And the president at the time was like, yeah, you're not getting all this money. I'm sorry. And then, of course, lo and behold, 10 years later, you have like a right-wing government coming in and be like, oh, sorry, we'll totally pay you all that money. You're like, motherfucker, you just turned this. So it's a long road ahead, but it's like fascinating having that like psychic break with the neoliberal norm and having people from the middle classes also kind of joining the struggle, who maybe otherwise weren't impacted before that, I think is good, right, for a mass movement. Is there something we didn't get to that you want to add or that people should know?
Well, I think, when dynamics in the diaspora have been complicated, for the minoritized communities and then progressive communities, like, many of the folks who have been part of these movements that I've named, they didn't vote for this regime, right? And many of them have been resisting it for a long time. And so there can sometimes be this like strange feeling to be like, yo, y'all are the ones that, were okay with Islamophobia. You were the ones that were complicit with the war crimes. You were the ones, and now you're in the streets, right? And, I think for myself, more than majoritarian hypocrisies, what is more important to me is the freedom and liberation of our peoples, right? So when we look at the long arc and what needs to happen, Goda needed to get out because he's responsible for murdering so many people, right? He's responsible.
Called the Terminator, right? He before this, I mean, when it comes to like the war on the Tamil Tigers and that whole, obviously the Tamil people generally, like,
it was indiscriminate killings.
Nickname was the Terminator, straight up. Like that's something I'm learning about him. So anyway, yes.
So and he needs to be held accountable for war crimes, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, as well as the corruption and thievery, right? So I'm an abolitionist, but I feel like he needs to go to The Hague. So I'm like, until we have a system to address war criminals, he needs to go to jail. So, but
at least he's never allowed to go in the pool again.
Oh, I don't think he's coming back into the country, right?
Back.
He held on to that presidency so that he could flee with impunity, because while he was president, he couldn't be charged. So
we've heard of this, even in this country. That's how Trump is going to try to avoid getting charged, is running again.
Yeah, and would the Sri Lankan people like to invade the United States and install a democracy? Because we can use some help.
Yeah.
You'd have to increase the lottery visas. And there's a lot of processes that would.
As long as
it sounds like a lot of admin, a lot of paperwork to do.
Can the drum circle expand wide enough?
Hey, I believe in vibrational. I think our particles and entanglement. So I think that we can catch the vibration, but on a more serious thing, I actually think that we do need to be looking at, what happens to a country when it defaults on its loans. What happens when a country is at the, crux of so many, we're talking also about the ways in which climate disaster has also impacted the islands as well. And there's, we have to shift the logic and the ways in which we understand how we organize humanity. We have to fundamentally shift human economies. We have to really question ethno-nationalism and this idea that we're going to divide and organize humans based on language and ethnicity with these militarized borders. What is our relationship to the land and to each other? I think there's a lot for us to recuperate from our ancient ways to be able to imagine what could be possible in the future, right? Yeah. So, similar to many indigenous communities and some of our ancient Tamil texts, the the ways in which humanity was organized was by like we were people of the coast, people of the dry lands, people of the fertile lands, you know, people of the forest and the jungle. So there are things that we can draw from our past about our healthy, loving devotion to the land and other beings. We can, this is a question, like, how do we actually want to organize our societies and economies? And what do we need to do to interrupt this destructive, extractive, murderous logic that we are finding ourselves at the mercy of right now?
Absolutely. Yes. I love, and these are the moments we can actually like start to like even dream about that stuff. Yalini Dream, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for bringing your that wisdom and then that groundedness. I really appreciate it, and on such short notice too. I hit you up last minute, and you were great and wonderful, and thank you. Everybody, Yalini, can we follow you on the socials? Is that a thing?
Yeah, at Yalini Dream, YALINI Dream. So, and I'm also on Instagram, and
yeah.
So
everybody follow Yalini, and we'll be obviously continuing to follow this story and sending, you know, if there's info on also how people abroad can like be in solidarity with materially, etc.
Absolutely. Oh, I also want to shout out the IUSF, which is the Inter-University Student Federation, which is the largest student union, and there's folks from all over the island, and they were the ones pushing things on the front line, who were getting water cannoned and tear gassed, and kept, regrouping and showing back up, and so. I mean, there are so many different groups who have done so many. I mean, you know, the environmental justice folks, they were part of cleaning up the palace, after the occupation. And, you know, and also had like a, solar panel truck at the, at the GG site. But there's so many different.
Social movements are so much cooler than ours. They're just so much cooler. Oh, I fucking hate it. Ours are so lame.
Oh.
I mean,
we have the potential, y'all. We do. We do. We can get it together.
Yalini, you're wonderful. Take very good care. Everybody follow Yalini on all the things, and
that was cool.
Very cool. It's like it's one of those, just a moment, like I am inspired by at a distance, but it feels like a huge moment because it like unlike Argentina had this, and a lot of countries like realized neoliberalism and they got really fucked a while ago. But it seems like Sri Lanka was sort of like hobbling along and doing okay, and cars were being imported, etc. And then,
I mean, it brings me back to like this question about social change that I'm sort of keeps coming up, which is that it's like, as hard as it is to overthrow the government, in the scheme of like historic projects, overthrowing the government is not actually that hard. These motherfuckers went out and camped in the streets for 3 months, and then the government collapsed. It's like, can you imagine? That overthrowing the government is not that hard compared to fundamentally transforming your society.
Sure.
And like doing all the great stuff that Yanni was talking about in terms of reimagining how we relate to the world and each other and the planet, all that stuff. Like, building a different
Can you do the second without the first is, I think, the big question, especially as I bitch about climate doom. I'm like, well, maybe we actually can't stop climate change through legislative means. That being said, I think of Naomi Klein, who's like, the government is the only one who can actually fucking mobilize enough money to do what needs to be done.
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's like, what we've seen from history. I mean, this is sort of the conundrum. Like, let's say that the Sri Lankan popular movements were as successful as they possibly could be in our wildest dreams, and what we've seen from around the world is that the international ruling class punishes people who get uppity in the global South.
Yes.
And so it's like, I don't know how to theorize that. Like, what do you do about that?
But not, I mean, yes and no. Like, I know people have been like brutalized. But again, like looking back to Argentina, like it wasn't a total rollback. There was like, they would never go back to full neoliberal economics. However, they went to soy monocrop, but they kept the money, which I think is the next step. It's like, how do you keep money internally, but then ultimately move away from capitalism? I don't know. And ultimately move away from extractive,
Right.
relationships to the earth.
And it's also an issue of scale, because Argentina is a lot bigger than Sri Lanka, and like is big enough to have a diversified economy.
Potentially. I don't know. I mean, I'm like, should we get Yalini back in here? But like, no, yes, maybe. But like, it's amazing how an entire giant country can be made to be like, oh no, you just produce soybeans. Like what? And like Sri Lanka is incredibly rich in terms of natural resources. So, anywho, to be TBD, y'all. We're gonna check in with the people in the pool and the people cooking lunch in the presidential kitchen. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.